Although they are exhaustive, although these are the only two options there are, neither is really acceptable. If all goes as planned, then we'll all be confused and maybe even a little agitated. But I assure you this is not some kind of game. Plato taught us that confusion is the feeling appropriate for philosophy. And I sincerely hold that when it comes to the big questions of life, we do well to embrace our confusion because we are in fact confused. It's just not clear what to believe. Maybe within an honest confusion and its embracing, there's a lesson about how we should live our lives, but I don't know. So, what are we talking about? Let me say something about how I understand the question that's posed in my title, Must Life Be Tragic? Now, there's one sense in which the answer to this question is an unqualified yes. And to be blunt, life must be tragic on this view because we all will die. And when we die, we will have left many good things undone. What's more, the splendid things that we did do in life will, after we die, in due course, be forgotten. Time will sweep away everything, and soon it will be as if none of us had ever lived. Anybody who would remember us, they too will die. Is that tragic? Well, maybe, maybe not. In any case, you may be relieved to know it's not what I'm going to be talking about tonight. I should add that neither will I be talking about all of the senseless pain and suffering in the world, the persistent, overwhelming, and seemingly, unfortunately, always increasing absence of justice, the even absence of decency in the world is indeed a tragedy, if anything is. I don't know if the world must be this way. But in any case, the tragedy of continuing suffering and injustice, the tragedy of continuing suffering and injustice is a tragedy before which I'm speechless, and I apologize for that. Okay, tonight I'm interested in a different kind of concern that one might be pursuing when one asks whether life must be tragic. One might hold that life is tragic because it is so often riddled with missed opportunities, squandered talent, untapped potential, false starts, blind alleys, regret, longing, and loss. On this view, every life is tragic because every life falls short. Every life fails to achieve things that it would be good to achieve. In every life, we might say, there is a moral remainder, an unrealized good, a righteous path not taken, and thus a loss, or if you will, a kind of moral incompleteness. Now, there are two ways to think about this moral incompleteness in life. Let's suppose that I, Robert Talisse, wish to be an outstanding guitar player, a chess master, a superlative spouse, an unsurpassed department chair, apologies to Jeff, and an excellent philosopher. And maybe, let's just suppose, I have it within me. I have the potential within me for each of these things. But alas, I certainly can't do it all, not in one lifetime. In devoting myself to, for example, being an excellent philosopher, I've had to abandon the project of achieving excellence in lots of other worthwhile things. There simply aren't enough hours in the day to achieve everything it would be good to achieve. Maybe there aren't enough hours in a life to achieve everything that makes a life good. Indeed, there aren't enough hours in a life to even pursue everything that makes a life good. Life's too damn short. Now, the shortness of life, more generally what we might just say, the limitedness of our resources, the scarcity of our resources of time and energy and effort, this is a primary cause of the moral incompleteness I've been talking about. But think about it for a minute. That life is short, and that our attention is limited, and that our effort is not infinite. These are all contingent facts that perhaps could be overcome in the future. Maybe with certain technological advances, the time of our life could be greatly expanded, the amount of energy we have, the kind of resources we have for attention and other kinds of effort could be vastly increased. So let me ask what I regard as a philosophical and a deep philosophical question. Given unlimited resources of time and energy and effort and all the rest, could you have it all? Could you achieve everything in life that would be worth achieving? Were we able somehow to remove our temporal and other limitations? Could a single human life manifest everything that makes life worthwhile? Could a single individual achieve excellence in music, philosophy, chess, art, department chairmanship, and everything else that makes life good? That's the question. If the answer to this question is no, that even given unlimited resources, it's still not possible to achieve everything, then I think the answer to the question posed in my title, Must Life Be Tragic?, is yes, our lives must be tragic. Tragedy is inescapable. Now, philosophers are commonly charged with engaging in idle speculation. And perhaps my query now strikes you as a case in point. I urge you, however, to not draw this conclusion, at least not yet. The question of whether it is possible to have it all, to achieve everything that makes a life good, might seem initially like a silly question. But I think it goes to the heart of a deep and urgent philosophical issue concerning the nature of value. So I urge you to bear with me. So let's begin. Now, if you are like me and believe that there are such things as objective values, real goods and bads, let's say, I think there are two ways to think about the nature of such value. One way to think about value has it that there is but one thing that is ultimately or intrinsically valuable, and all other valuable things are mere instruments towards or sources of that one thing. We might say that on such a view, value is one big thing that has many parts. However, crucially, the parts owe their value to being the members of the whole. We can call this view monism, and anyone who's familiar with moral philosophy will recognize that one of the most influential theories of all time, and rightfully so in my view, is unabashedly monistic. I'm talking, of course, about utilitarianism. There are other monist views, to be sure, but utilitarianism is the most influential. And again, I should say, I believe deservedly so. Now, utilitarianism holds that pleasure, by which they mean to include the absence of pain, is the only thing that is intrinsically good. It's the only thing that's good in and of itself. Everything else that is good has its value in virtue of either being an instance of pleasure or a source of it. Think of candy bars as the source of pleasure and the taste of the candy bar as being an instance of it. Now, this statement of utilitarianism might leave you with the impression that it's an unserious view, one which would elevate to a moral imperative a single-minded or wanton pleasure-seeking. And a couple of days before spring break, you might be thinking of such pleasure-seeking. But it's not really so crass as that. The utilitarian identifies pleasure, including the absence of pain, as the one thing that's ultimately of value. But importantly, the utilitarian denies that his pleasure is any more valuable than yours. That is, the utilitarian holds that because pleasure is ultimately what's of value, more of it in the world is better than less, and it doesn't matter whose pleasure it is, or where it is, or in what kind of creature it resides. Accordingly, the utilitarian prescribes an ethic in which we should each act so as to maximize pleasure across the board, insofar as we are able, for all sentient beings in the world. Now, when put this way, I think it sounds utterly sensible as a moral doctrine. Indeed, in its way, it strikes me that utilitarianism is unassailable as a philosophical view. Still, I'm convinced it's not correct, but that's a story for another day, or probably more likely for me and some future therapist. It's true, it's a puzzling, I'm convinced it's wrong, but I can't refute it. The element of utilitarianism that's relevant for our view, for our talk tonight is a consequence of its unrelenting conception of value. It's unrelentingly monist conception of value. Like all monists, utilitarians must hold that for any two things that are of value, one must be better than the other, or else they are of equal value. After all, the utilitarian reasons, everything that is good is either pleasure or a source of it. The value of anything, then, consists in a quantity of pleasure. For example, let's imagine that you must choose a dessert. A piece of cake is a source of some quantity of pleasure, let's say. And let's also say that a piece of pie is likewise a source of some quantity of pleasure. Now, the utilitarian reckons, correctly, I should say, that it must be the case that either the cake brings more pleasure than the pie brings more pleasure than the cake, or they bring an equal quantity of pleasure. Utilitarian says you, as a moral agent, should choose that option which maximizes pleasure. Monism is the part of the utilitarian doctrine that holds that all value can be quantified and compared in that way. It's worth noting here that monism as a conception of value is not necessarily hostile to our everyday common sense and, I think, deeply well-justified views about the value of diversity and toleration. Monism is a thesis about the nature of value, not the claim that everything should be alike. It is fully open to monists to hold that the sources of value are quite diverse, responsive to individual temperaments, quirks, preferences, and even whims. Let's not forget, John Stuart Mill is among our most incisive defenders of individuality, individual liberty, spontaneity, weirdness, eccentricity. Yet, as a utilitarian, he's a monist through and through. He thinks that utility or pleasure in the absence of pain is, as he says, the ultimate appeal on all questions. In short, monism is not myopia. Monism is not a one-size-fits-all theory of value. Monism is rather a value is one thing that comes in many sizes theory of value. Now, monism is driven by a commanding philosophical principle. To put it in a way that owes ultimately to Plato, when we have several distinct items which warrant being called by the same name, they must have some property in common which explains the fact that we call them all by the same name. So here's a list of things: fire trucks, stop signs, cherries, roses, and blood. They're different in all kinds of respect, but they have one thing in common, namely the property of being red, or typically being red. The red may differ in hue or degree, of course, but they all provide instances of the same color. And having that property in common is what explains the fact that when a kid points to a stop sign and says red, and then points to a rose and says red, we don't correct him. Monism affirms the same kind of thought about value. Choose your favorite list of valuable things: honesty, friendship, kindness, integrity, freedom, love, open-mindedness, toleration, ingenuity, what have you. Monism says that the items on your list must have some property in common which accounts for the fact that they are all instances of valuable things. This common property is the explanation of why they're on the list, after all. We can see then that, according to monism, it is indeed possible to have it all, at least in one sense of possible. If value is, as the monist contends, one big thing, then all of the valuable things are valuable by way of a single property. For the utilitarian, it's pleasure, or the ability to produce it. Trade-offs and losses amongst goods are the products of contingent limitations on time and energy and attention and other resources. In principle, if monism is true, everything that's valuable can be achieved in a life because there's really only one thing that's ultimately of value. Now, I wonder if monism strikes you as plausible. If it does, you're in the good company not only of Plato, but of Aristotle, Kant, Hegel, Bentham, Ronald Dworkin, and many others who are luminaries among philosophers. So I want now to call attention to what I regard as monism's most serious defect. Here's a question for you. Which is greater, Hamlet or Macbeth? Think for a minute. This is surely a difficult question. And before we can make progress in answering it, we need to discuss many complex issues about aesthetic criteria, for example, literary norms, for example, facts about the time in which Shakespeare was writing, for example. Maybe our discussion, which is greater, Hamlet or Macbeth, would prove interminable. Or maybe we come to a resolution of the following kind. We might say that, well, if we presuppose a certain set of criteria for Shakespearean greatness, Hamlet is the best. But if we were to change the criteria a little bit to another, still plausible set of criteria for Shakespearean greatness, we'd have to say that Macbeth is the best. We may, of course, then go on, arguing about which set of criteria are the correct ones, or is the most appropriate. But the point is that we'd then be trying to figure out what the correct measure of greatness is. We wouldn't be arguing in a way about Hamlet versus Macbeth. We'd be arguing about what makes a Shakespearean play great. But now let's consider a different kind of question from the question, which is better, Hamlet or Macbeth? Here's a question for you. Which is greater, Hamlet or Starry Night? Think. Here's another question. Which is greater, Homer's Iliad or Michelangelo's David? Allow me to continue. How many Woody Allen films are equal in value to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony? What's of greater value, a lifelong friendship or a really good Robert Frost poem? How many promises kept make up for a devious lie? Is an act of familial loyalty 4 times as valuable as a random act of kindness or not? I could go on, but I think that you see where this is going. These are very odd questions. We might wonder whether they even make sense. They might be cleverly disguised bits of nonsense. But let's suppose for a moment at least that they do make sense. It does make sense, in some sense of making sense, to ask whether an act of familial loyalty is exactly 4 times as valuable as an act of a random act of kindness. What are we to make of questions like these? Now, we may of course disagree about how we should answer them. Yet importantly, when we disagree about Hamlet versus Starry Night, we don't seem to be disagreeing about which criteria are appropriate. It seems to me that what makes these questions odd, disorienting in a way, is that we have difficulty in thinking that there are criteria in the first place. Suppose, if you will allow me just to impose one more supposition on you, that both Hamlet and Starry Night are exemplary artistic achievements. I don't think that's asking too much. The problem with monism is that if we are monists, once we claim that both Starry Night and Hamlet are valuable, we are required to say that there is, at least in principle, an answer to the question of which one is greater and by how much. The same goes on monism for questions of value. According to monism, there is a number of kept promises that are equal in value, or I'm sorry, that make up for a devious lie. There is some number of friendships that is worth exactly as much as a really good Robert Frost poem. And there is a number of random acts of kindness that is morally equivalent to a familial act of familial loyalty. In short, monism holds that all valuable things are fungible, commensurable on a single scale of value. Monists explain the oddness of the question, which is better, Hamlet or Starry Night, by invoking the difficulty of measuring value in certain contexts. The monist cannot allow the possibility that 2 things may both be of value and yet be utterly distinct in kind. Monists cannot say that Hamlet and Starry Night are both extremely valuable, each in its own distinctive way. To allow this, if the monist were to allow it, the monist would have to deny that all valuable things have a single value-making, goodness-making property in common. All of a sudden, it seems to me at least, monism looks crazed. And here the contours of a competing conception of value come into view. The monist holds that value is all one big thing. The pluralist, by contrast, contends that value comes in many distinct kinds. Pluralism denies that for any pair of valuable items, one is either better than the other or they are of equal value. According to the pluralist, items A and B, two good things, A and B, can both be valuable without there being any way, not even in principle, to say which is better. This is possible because, according to pluralism, certain objective values are in nature heterogeneous. It could be that A and B are both objectively good without there being a common measure of value against which to rank their goodness. This may sound like a strange thought, so let me try to capture it one more time. Pluralism holds that there are many distinct kinds of value that are objective and unique. It is the claim that there are differences among valuable items that are not merely differences in the source or extent of some ultimately valuable thing. Consequently, it is open to the pluralist to say that there just is no answer to the question of whether a familial act of loyalty is 4 times as valuable as a random act of kindness. Pluralists contend that this question, and the other kinds of questions that we were asking about Robert Frost poems and friendships and Woody Allen movies and Starry Night, pluralists contend that these questions commit an error. They mistakenly assume that loyalty and kindness, or friendships and Robert Frost poems, are merely different instances or sources of a single kind of valuable thing. According to the pluralist, it could be that loyalty and kindness are each goods of their own distinct kind. Now, though it is a more complicated doctrine than monism, pluralism almost always strikes those who first hear it as a most splendid philosophy of value. Indeed, it seems liberating in that it allows not only for diversity in the ways that we pursue good lives, but it also recognizes an actual diversity in the good lives themselves and in the goods manifest in such lives. Pluralism, furthermore, seems a more humane view because it can recognize that not all values can be fit into a neat system or a neat market of comparison and exchange. After all, the pluralist says, the betrayal that one commits when one tells a devious lie might simply be beyond compensation, no matter how many promises you subsequently keep. Finally, pluralism seems to lend considerable support to common sense ideas about the value of toleration. If the monist is right and value is all one big thing, then maybe it's easy for me to be in an especially good position to figure out what's good for you. But if we think with the pluralist that values are objective but yet of unique kinds, heterogeneous, then we'll be far less likely to presume to know how to direct the pursuits of others. Pluralism, it seems, has it all. But it doesn't. Pluralism comes at a price. If there are heterogeneous values, then there are goods that are inherently in conflict with each other, goods whose natures are so different that the pursuit of one would require us to violate the others. Imagine a pluralist who recognizes that the life of the disciplined monk and that of the impulsive artist each manifest a distinctive kind of value. We might imagine a pluralist saying, well, each of these ways of life realizes its own kind of good, a good that is not definable in or reducible to the good of the other life. If this is the case, or this is the story about the value of the life of the monk and the life of the impulsive artist. The pluralist, it seems to me, has to say that the monkish goods are necessarily lost in the life of the impulsive artist, and vice versa. To pursue the monk's discipline is to necessarily abandon the artist's impulsiveness. What's more, as pluralism maintains, discipline and impulsiveness are distinctive kinds of objective value. The achievement of one, even the achievement of superlative excellence in one, provides no compensation for the loss of the other. The monk, no matter how great a monk he is, loses a unique kind of good. His life fails to manifest something that would make it even better. And since what is lost on the pluralist picture is unique in kind, there's just no way to make up for it. It hangs out as a loss, uncompensated, irreplaceable, forever. Now, perhaps you'll think this is old news. We know that life requires us to make choices, and in choosing one thing, we leave other things behind, and we often leave other good things behind. You can't have your cake and eat it too, some people say. No big deal. Not so fast. If pluralism is true, there's more to the story than you can't have your cake and eat it too. Pluralism requires us to recognize the existence of heterogeneous, unique kinds of good. Their heterogeneity means that they can come into conflict with other goods. Goods clash. And when they clash, in fact, what it is for goods to clash is for them to make competing claims on us, to lay on us competing kinds of duties. That these goods are objectively so, according to the pluralist, means that each good has a real claim on us. As they are objectively good, they are each proper objects of pursuit. Consequently, to fail to achieve any of them is to fail to morally do something you ought to do. It's to fall short. Most importantly, though, pluralism requires us to see the normative pull of each distinctive good as a unique kind of normative claim on us. When we are confronted with the choice between monkish discipline and artistic impulsiveness, choose whatever goods you think are more appropriate in this context, there is just no way to calculate the relative merits of our options, no way to see one good before us as the more encompassing, complete, or overarching good. That's because heterogeneous goods don't have that kind of relation to each other. There's no such thing as the more encompassing good when you're dealing with goods of distinct kinds. We simply, in these cases, must choose. And in choosing, we will inevitably lose something that we also must regard as precious and irreplaceable. In short, if pluralism is the truth about value, then we cannot avoid moral loss. Even given infinite resources, an infinite number of years to live, an infinite amount of time and energy and attention, we're doomed to live lives that are morally incomplete. Our lives, on the pluralist view, are necessarily, irremediably, and inescapably tragic. And that's the sting of the pluralist view. It entails that our lives have to be tragic. Not only that they often are, not only that tragedy is really, really hard to avoid, but that it is inevitable. If you are willing to accept this, let me try to draw out one further implication of pluralism. It seems to me that pluralism undermines our ability to see our own lives as reasoned, integrated moral projects. Recall that according to pluralism, the life of the monk and the life of the artist are distinctively good lives, and there's no common measure between them that would allow us to judge which kind of life is morally better. That's because if they are distinctive, heterogeneous kinds of good lives, there's no such thing as one bearing the relation to the other of better than. But surely things can't look this way to the artist. In order to pursue his life with the requisite amount of intensity, devotion, and dedication, he must see in his artistic projects, in his life, in his aspirations, something not only distinct from the other things he might have done, but better than them. Imagine an artist saying to himself, let me put on an artist voice, I am pursuing my life as an artist, but I had no more reason to do this than I had to become a monk, or for that matter, a banker. Any of these lives would have been good in their own way. And there's no sense, and there's no sense in which my artistic life is aimed at anything more noble or grander than the life of my banker. In holding this judgment of his own life, our artist will have, it seems to me, abandoned a crucial part of what it is to live authentically like an artist. In fact, it seems to me that to hold this assessment of his own life, our artist will have lost what makes the life of artistic impulsiveness even good. It seems to me, to put it sort of in the form of a philosophical principle, one that I hope is philosophical, it seems to me that certain of life's goods can be realized only if they are accompanied by the judgment that the good in question is especially worthy, better, nobler, more excellent than the other goods one might have pursued instead. That is, perhaps in order to see our lives as morally coherent and intelligible, we need to see our lives as the monist sees our lives. We have to be able to see the value that we are pursuing in our lives or trying to manifest in our lives as one big integrated thing. Now, I've tried to make pluralism look somewhat shabby to you. I've tried to suggest to you that it requires us to take an implausible view about our own moral lives. Still, you might wonder, what of all those odd questions about Hamlet and Starry Night and Robert Frost's poetry and friendship? Didn't they show us that pluralism has got to be correct? No. I fear that earlier we put a little too much trust in our dumb sense of the oddness of those questions. Yes, it's not clear to me what to say in response to the question, Beethoven or Shakespeare. And perhaps we're correct to think that these kinds of questions are odd because they ask us to compare value across what might seem different genres of value. Maybe all that's correct. But it seems to me now that this does not suffice for a proof of pluralism. And to see this, let me ask you a different question. Who's better, Shakespeare or Britney Spears? That's a question that asks you to compare value across genres of value. But I think I know the right answer to that question. And I think you know the right answer to that question. If pluralism is true, you should be disoriented by that question in the same way you're disoriented by the question Shakespeare or Beethoven. But you're not. Similarly, I don't know how many kept promises it takes to make up for a devious lie, but I do know that even serious moral transgressions can be compensated for. That some degree of good behavior makes up for bad behavior and makes one deserving of forgiveness. Pluralist, it seems, has to deny that. So where are we? I began by asking, if you had unlimited resources of time, energy, attention, effort, could you achieve everything in life that would be worth achieving? We've only scratched the surface, and it's not clear what to say, I think. We know now that if pluralism is true, we cannot have it all, because pluralism entails that even given infinite resources, some goods are realizable only at the expense of others. We also know that if monism is true, the scarcity of our resources is what prevents us from having it all. Yet we also saw that monism requires us to see all value as fungible, And I still think there's something about that that's fishy. Can we really see our friendships as goods of the same kind as slices of pizza, differing only in the amount of pleasure they produce, if indeed they differ at all? The monist has to say yes. Friendships and pizza, same kind of thing, if they're both good. Maybe you don't think pizza's good, or maybe you don't think friendship is good, in which case you've got problems. We're stuck, or maybe we're too late. Our lives are already underway. We've invested ourselves in certain kinds of ends. We've devoted our lives to achieving certain kinds of things. We've left other things in the past, in the dust, and there's no turning back. And yet, given only these few moments of reflection, at least it strikes to me that really we don't know what we're doing. Is that tragic? Maybe. But perhaps the tragedy is mitigated, even if only in a little way, if we recognize the peculiarity of our condition. Our striving for a good life pulls us in imposing and incompatible directions. We may seek moral completeness, yet we are also drawn to the idea that goods are irreducibly precious and unique. I think the only way forward is to adopt a very strange view with a very strange name, non-monist anti-pluralism. We should continue to believe that there are objective goods, real goods and evils, real values, but we should also accept no monist guarantee that they're all going to hang together in the end. And we should be prepared for the possibility that moral fragmentation and incompleteness and loss is inevitable. But at the same time, we should also reject the pluralist idea that it's naive to strive for lives without loss, or misguided to want to see in our lives an encompassing good, something that makes up for everything that we left behind. We should not accept that fragmentation and its corresponding tragedy is inevitable. Now, the trick is to sustain this precarious and conflicted standpoint. Remember what I said about philosophy. We're confronted with two visions of value. One threatens to homogenize the goods that are available in a human life. The other short-circuits our aspiration for completeness. At most, one is correct, but neither seems adequate. To adopt either at this point would not only be premature, it would also be to add an actual tragedy to one that is, at least by my lights, at present, merely possibly tragic. So lucky for us, there's still a lot more philosophy to do. Thank you. So I'd be happy to be refuted.
I think it would be good if you ask questions as loud as possible so everybody can hear.
And I'll try to restate in some way what you ask. I'm sorry? Oh, yes, please. Okay, so there are two questions. One is, what about subjective artistic judgments? Maybe they're like moral judgments. The other is, what about cases in which you're satisfied by a particular kind of life because of some estimation about yourself, right? Now, it seems to me that in the Britney Spears and Shakespeare case, I just think the 12-year-old is wrong. And if Britney Spears and Beethoven are a little bit too close to you, we can think of all kinds of other. Think of something that's really bad. And then imagine somebody saying, like, you know, the freecredit.com jingle on TV. Say, that's better than Hamlet. Well, right, but note, if we're thinking about values as objective, we're thinking about the possibility that things might be valuable independently of what people prefer, right? Independently of what people happen to like, right? And it seems to me that there's a lot to be said for subjectivism or phenomenalism about value. That is, views that say, well, no, moral value is just kind of like, you know, taste or thinking something's cool. You say, hey, that's cool. Nobody gets to say, oh, you've made a mistake. They might browbeat you and say, well, you can't be one of us. But they don't think you're in error, right? They just think, well, you've got crazy views about things. I just think it's worth holding out the possibility that value is not like that. And I think that there are good arguments for thinking that it's not. And in fact, I think there are good arguments for thinking that you think it's not, regardless of what you think you think. The other point about sort of the artist and feeling self-actualized, I think both the pluralist and the monist can make sense of that. I don't think anybody's got to deny that what you pursue in life isn't simply a matter of assessing what things are valuable for lives in some abstract sense, but you might think what one pursues in life has to be keyed or tracking some hopefully reliable estimation of what your capacities are, right? So look, I'm willing to say the life of an NBA basketball player probably realizes all kinds of goods that I am just not going to be able to realize in life, right? And so there's nothing in pluralism that would say, well, then, you know, you've got to try to realize everything that's good. No, you can make assessments on what's possible. The point, though, that's crucial is that for the pluralist, I think for anybody who has the same view of these matters, for anybody living any kind of life, there is at least one other kind of life that was available to them at which they could have had a reasonable chance of success, which they had to abandon given what they pursued, right? That is, maybe the good that attaches to the life of an NBA player is not one that's available to me given my height, right? And my bad eyesight, and all kinds of other facts about me that I would never go into in public. But that doesn't mean that there weren't several other kinds of life other than the one I'm living now, which was reasonable to expect if I devoted myself to it. I could have done well at that too. I think every life is like that. That's the kind of moral loss, right, that the pluralist is committed to. And notice, let me just say one more thing. The pluralist has to describe that loss as uncompensatable, right? That is, if you think goods are of unique kinds, the fact that you are an excellent philosopher in no way makes up for the fact that you did not pursue poetry, right? There's no amount of good philosopherness that gets you any closer to making up for the loss of good poet. Oh yeah, you could be fulfilled, you could be very happy with your life, right? But if you believe that value is many different kinds of things, right? You can't avoid seeing your life as lacking something that it would have been good to achieve that does not get made up for by the fact that you're fulfilled, right? It's the monist who says, well, if you're fulfilled, maybe fulfillment in some description is the one thing that's ultimately of value. Maybe that's the thing that ties all the valuable things together. In fact, some people, maybe John Stuart Mill and other kinds of sophisticated utilitarians are like this. They want to say, part of what makes something good is the fact that it's you who did it, right? That you chose it, that you owned it, right? That it was authentically you, right? This is part of the story of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, right? And so, you know, a monist can hold that view, and a monist might say, but if you're fulfilled, it's all good. But that's to say that value is one big thing, or at least it's to deny that value is many heterogeneous things. Yeah. Yeah, but those will all be examples of goods of the same kind. That's why they're diminishing. That's why you can rank them, right? The pluralist is interested in conflicts among goods of distinct kinds, right? So you're right that, you know, I don't think philosophy is like this, but maybe, you know, the nth article published is not as satisfying as the first article published, or the nth lecture given is not as satisfying as the first one. Maybe that's right. But if we're talking about goods that are heterogeneous in the way that the pluralist envisions, there couldn't be a diminishing return, because that would require commensuration. That would require, this candy bar is not as satisfying, pleasurable, fit in your monist view about the nature of value as the last one, right? So I think that what's being denied by the pluralist is any way to make judgments of that kind. Notice, one further thought, diminishing returns talk is almost always utilitarian talk. Almost always some version of cost-benefit analysis talk. Yeah. Andrew.
Yeah, so I have two questions related maybe around. So the first one is, I guess I was waiting for you to say something about what you thought tragic meant. Because sometimes it seemed like you were using it as moral completeness, and other times it seemed like you were saying it's just a life without any moral opportunity cost. And maybe those are connected, and I guess you're frowning.
Yeah, well, let me just say, the question is what I mean by tragedy. So tragedy, I think, is what makes our lives tragic, if pluralism is true, is not only the moral loss, but the uncompensated nature, the uncompensatable nature of that loss. The fact that if you think pluralism is true, every life is going to be of the following sort. Could have done something, not only that they didn't do, could have done something that they didn't do, and thus the life is, in some unique, precious, irreplaceable way, uncompensated way, worse for it.
Okay, well, so maybe this is connected then. So the examples seem to shift between when you were talking about the monist view. The monist was always about two items or goods, and then the pluralist was always lives. It seems like from moving here.
Right.
So I guess I'm just wondering, so it looks like if that's the definition, then it's, this is clarification now. Is it clear that then if your definition of a tragic life is those two components, then on the monist view, tragedy not really on the cards?
No, if you're a monist, life can still be tragic. It just is not necessarily so. If you're a monist, there are all kinds of opportunities you could miss. There might be all kinds of opportunities that are unique, not because of the value that they manifest, but because of the fact that you don't get the opportunity more than once to do that, and you lose it, and it's gone forever, right? But notice that on the monist view, you always get to say, sure, I missed that opportunity, but look at what I did instead, and it makes up, maybe not fully, but it does make up for the lost opportunity if I do well at some other valuable thing. The pluralist has to say that there are cases in which, no matter how good your life is in one respect, you don't make any progress in making up for something else that you lost. Sir, yeah, here in the white shirt, yeah.
You were talking about how then, in the monist view, you're seeking to maximize some value, basically.
On certain views of monism.
Right.
Right, in certain monist views, like utilitarianism. Yeah, they don't have to be maximizing. Right. But see.
Now, I mean, do you see that there's a big problem, or any problem, in sort of accepting a version of pluralism where rather than potentially maximizing a certain value in the world, just minimizing the inherent tragedy of the world? That, okay, I could be a basketball player or a chef, and I have to pick one of those two things. And my life will be devoid in some way, shape, or form from having chosen one of those. But I can potentially make a choice to minimize the overall loss that I would feel in both, right? Just being a mediocre everything.
Right, but notice.
Okay, well, I can't maximize anything. I'm going to lose. I know I have to lose.
Right.
hedge my bet.
So we don't want a moral view to say, well, because of tragedy, everyone should aspire to be mediocre. We don't want that. But notice, right, we're not talking about the loss you feel, right? You might not feel the loss, right? On the pluralist view, we're just talking about a real good that had to be left behind, that could not have been manifest. And if you're a pluralist, you say, that's not a good that was just apparent to me. That was a real, precious thing that was left behind by me. And the fact that it was left behind by me in the effort to achieve some other precious thing, the pluralist has to say, so what? Right? That doesn't tell any, might reconcile us to our condition, but doesn't in any way make up for the loss of good because that was a unique thing, right? I'm sorry, maybe I didn't understand.
Yeah, no.
Okay.
I mean, I agree with that.
Okay.
And I'm accepting that there isn't then inherently a tragedy that is implied by this.
Right.
And it's not just a tragedy that is because of the constraints of our condition.
Right.
It's necessary by the definition of the.
It's built into the fabric of value.
Well, I guess I'm kind of answering my own question, and it doesn't really make sense. But I mean, then there's no way of comparing them, and so
Yeah.
there's no way of quantifying
Yeah.
what that loss is.
That's exactly right.
And
That's why there's no way of saying, look at how great a philosopher I am. That makes up for all of the great guitar performances that I can't do now.
right.
There's no way to say that. Well, you could say it, but there's no way to make the more, that cannot be a proper moral judgment, right? Yes?
So my question has some stuff in common with the last two. So at several points you said things of the, like, if pluralism is true, life is necessarily tragic because one can't have all good things, or because one can't achieve all that is worth achieving, which is another question because I don't know whether you were judging the value of a life by the amount of good things achieved or the amount of good things had, because when we were talking about monism and utilitarianism, we were talking about pleasure and how pleasure is the only good, and pleasure is not necessarily an achievement you have to get through guitar playing. In fact, on monism, you could have it through eating cake or what have you. But that's, sorry, getting sidetracked. That's not my main question.
Okay.
So what does it mean to say that a life is tragic, that it isn't the best imaginable, or that it doesn't contain all possible good things? That's not what we normally mean by tragic.
Well, so I was using the word tragic in neither of those ways. So here's what I would say. I think that on pluralism, life is necessarily tragic, not only because every life involves moral loss, but because if pluralism is true, every life involves moral loss that you have to see as uncompensated. You have to see a unique kind of good as abandoned, maybe even violated, right? You have to be able to, so the uncompensadedness of the loss, in fact, the inherent or intrinsic uncompensated nature of the loss is what's tragic. We have to, if pluralism is right, each of us should say about each of our lives, no matter how well I did, something unique and precious that had a claim on my allegiance got left behind.
But, well, to never have something is not to have lost that something. Or to never pursue something isn't, to never have pursued being a basketball player isn't to have lost your NBA contract.
Well, that's certainly true.
Which I know isn't what you're saying. You're not saying lost in the sense of had and
Right.
no longer had, but lost in the sense of
Something.
among all possibilities only got one thing. But
No. It's loss in the sense of something had a claim on me, had a claim to my allegiance, or an obligation.
The best possible life, a life that has all possible.
I'm not saying that a best possible life is a life that has all possible. A life without loss of this tragic sort is a life in which there's no moral obligation that in some sense of could have satisfied, you failed to satisfy. So it's the fact that in recognizing with the pluralist that these are heterogeneous objective goods, the fact that they're objective means they've got a claim on you. Maybe not strong enough to create an obligation, but to say, I ought to be pursued by you. And every life has to leave behind a plethora of things that correctly say, in this moral language, I ought to be pursued by you.
I guess I just don't see that claim. I don't feel like my potential basketball playing self has any sort of claim on me.
Then you don't recognize that life as manifesting a unique kind of good.
Okay, well, what about something that, a good that I could see as a good for myself and achievable by myself?
An objective good,
An objective good.
a thing that makes a life better to have done it, yes.
Right. I just don't see that choosing one from alternatives is tragic, but never mind.
Okay. Phil.
I just wonder whether I ought to be pursued by you is not a statement you haven't invented. We make claims on the world make claims on us. Possibilities make claim on actual human beings, or is this
Sure.
how so?
We can make sense of, well, let's put it this way. The fact that we can make sense of fiction, right, gives us all kinds, these are cases in which it's not really the world making a claim on us. We can understand, right, moral dilemmas that we're not in, right? Maybe we can even understand moral dilemmas that nobody's ever been in, but we can recognize them as conflicts of obligation, right? Yeah, I'm not, I guess that strikes me as very peculiar. So why I couldn't say that because the life that I am not following of being a grandmaster at chess, to recognize that as a distinctive kind of good that a life might achieve, to be able to sort of maybe even metaphorically understand that as the possible Talisse chess player saying, you know, you're neglecting me.
Or do you decide that chess is important to you? And if you haven't made that decision, if you decided that something else is more important than chess to you, then that goes sort of to the back of the room.
Well, yeah, I just think that that's a conception of value that has got other problems, right? In which values are not objective. Values are phenomenal or they're subjective, right? To recognize something as a value is necessary for its being one, right? Is a kind of value phenomenalism that I think is philosophically problematic for other reasons. Lou.
This seems to be the heart of it, right?
Good.
On some level, this is a really weird notion of pluralism. So let me ask the question this way. If there are no human beings, are there things of value?
Yes. No one.
How do you know they are value?
I don't know which the things are, but look, one could say, right?
But if there are no human beings,
Yep.
are there things of value? I'm trying to figure out how you're going to be able to speak at all about it.
So let's imagine we all disappear in 20 minutes. Starry Night will still be a beautiful painting.
How is that?
How could the fact that we're not here change the fact that it's a beautiful painting?
Because beauty is relational relative to us. Now, this is the crux.
That's an assertion, not an argument.
No, but you speak about objective values, and you say during the talk that ultimately you really can't make good on that.
Say this thing, I'm sorry?
For you, the key is the objectivity of value
Right.
and utilitarian position. But there's a way in which you really can't make good on that all the way out philosophically.
Not in any way that you can't make good on your alternative conception.
Right, but I'm not trying to make the case that you are. I can live with that.
Right. But
I don't have the same risk factor that you do with the line of argument. Because I can be a pluralist on very different terms as you construe, because you're construing pluralism on the notion of objectivity of values. I wouldn't do it.
well, we can use the words in different ways. And if by pluralism, you're not committed to a thesis about intrinsically conflicting objective values, then you shouldn't have any problem with my thesis whatsoever.
No, I'm just trying to figure out how yours works.
It works like this. Pluralism requires us to recognize the following as a conceptual truth. Every life leaves something morally behind that it ought not leave behind. Monism is the view that says the only reason why lives fail, and maybe our lives must fail to achieve everything it would be good for life to achieve, is because life's too short. It's not a conceptual truth, it's a contingent truth that life involves moral loss. So it's a distinction between monism, which holds that the necessity of moral loss is contingent on some hard facts about life, the length of it, the limitations on our time and attention. Pluralism holds that even removing all of those limitations, the scarcity of those resources, life would still require us to abandon things that are good. Okay. Yep.
Okay, this might just be a different version of Lee's question. But I guess I want to ask you to clarify more the difference between non-monist anti-pluralism and pluralism. So you seem to, a lot of your discussion of pluralism seems to indicate that there's not just a heterogeneity and incommensurability between any values, any two values, all values, but that there seems to be an infinite amount of values, so that your sort of non-monist anti-pluralism seems to put some limit on how many values. And I just wonder where the line now in pluralism or in your non-monist anti-pluralism, the line is between a value and an instance or what's the other word? Oh my god. Right, an instance or a source of a value. Right. So what if it's all lives have to be part sport, part art, part moral?
Right.
But I might choose music and you might choose painting. Where is the incommensurability, and how many values is too many?
You're right that any pluralist view, unlike a monist view, right? Because monist views are all just about, there's just one thing ultimately anyway. They just differ in its source and extent. You're right that on a pluralist view, there's going to be a lingering question, right? How many of these kinds of goods are there? Are there 12 or are there 120? And let me say sort of one further thing, right, that I think is in the question, right? The pluralist has to give us an account, right, of the difference between a really, really, really hard moral choice and a choice between incommensurable goods, right? Because you want to say, at least it seems to me, one would want to say to the pluralist, look, the mere long-lastingness of moral controversies is not yet enough to get a thesis of the nature of the values at stake. We need something else, right? Now, one could give, 3 or 4 different versions of this view, which come down on in different ways on how many objective goods there are. Some pluralists give a list, right? Always suspicious, in my view. And some pluralists don't give a list, also problematic, in my view, for the reasons that I think you're raising. But it still seems to me, right, that no matter how that issue shakes out, about which are the objective, heterogeneous, inherently conflicting goods, that's a different kind of issue from this conceptual one, right? That just says, like, however that shakes out. Maybe there are only 2, right? Maybe all the values fit together except for these 2, right? And so maybe lives are tragic in this sense only because you can't get both of those 2 adequately into the same life. However that shakes out, still seems to me that it's an interesting philosophical question about, so let me just, one more thing about that, right? I think it's always open to the anti-pluralist, forget about the non-monist part for a second, for the anti-pluralist always to say the following. Look, pluralist, if your conception of values, A and B, is such that these are heterogeneous, objective, conflictual, incommensurable, that sounds to me more like a proof that you don't have the right conceptions of those values, right? Maybe I don't have the right conception of the values either, but it seems to me open to the anti-pluralist to say, maybe it's worth, as a philosophical matter, to want to not rest with conceptions of particular goods, such that we're required to recognize their incommensurability. Maybe it's worth trying until we can't try no more to see value as one big thing, right? And in fact, that's the view I've got, right? Okay.
We have a witching hour a few minutes away, so how about one more question?
One more question from somebody who's not a professional philosopher. Oh, I can't call Han. Yes.
In talking about the pluralist and the aspiration for many possible lives, I was thinking about the example of Lionel Barrymore, who started out wanting to be a painter so badly, and he trained in Paris, and he came back to New York, and he was desperate to be a painter, and he was confronted with these brilliant painters that were working at the time around him, and he said, this is impossible, I have to just be an actor, because my family is full of actors, and that's plan B, and he ends up being this brilliant actor, and yet continues throughout his life to make art. So, as a pluralist, could you say that that was a failure on his part? Because he did continue to make art, but it's a question of his aspiration. He scaled it back, and he attained incredible heights as an actor.
Sure.
That he didn't want to be. I mean, he has potential for both.
Good. Let me say this is a good kind of case. Let me say one complicating thing that didn't come up in the talk, but I think has to be part of the pluralist's picture of value. There are values of the sort that you're describing in this case, between excellent actor and excellent artist. Was he a painter? Is that the kind of photographer? Okay. In which it looks as if we want to say these two values, or excellence in these two areas, can't be fit into the same life because what it is to pursue excellence in the one just requires you to leave out you don't have the time, right? Imagine a slightly different kind of, someone wants to be an excellent boxer and an excellent violinist. You just can't do the one thing to your hands and expect to be good at the other thing. Okay, so there are certain kinds of values that is inherently in conflict because of what their pursuit requires you to do. Now let me think of a different kind of case where there are two kinds of lives, where it's not simply the case that the pursuit of one requires you to let the other go by the wayside, or requires things of you that disable the pursuit of the other. There are certain kinds of goods, it seems to me, that are related in the following way. The pursuit of one requires you to deny the goodness of the other, right? So let me give one famous example. John Stuart Mill and another philosopher named Matthew Arnold. Matthew Arnold thinks, right, the key to a good life is tradition, right? Is the sweetness and light of what came before, of the classics, right? Of conformity to a set of traditions that have proven successful over generations, and that's where they get their value from, right? This is, by the way, not an implausible view of the matter. Of course, if you're a Matthew Arnoldian, you think that John Stuart Mill, the guy who says, never do anything just because it's always been done that way, right? The real good life is the life of individuality, which means striking out on your own, living a life according to your own judgments about good and bad, right? If you're an Arnoldian, you have to see not only the Millian is living a different life, but is living a life that's not at all valuable, right? And if you're, right, remember, Mill famously says, conformity to tradition, that's the chief. It's not the kings and the tyrants that are the real threat to human happiness. It's conformism that's the real threat. So if you're a Millian, if you recognize those values, you have to see the Arnoldian not only as a good life that you can't achieve, but to be a Millian is to reject the thought that the Arnoldian life could possibly be good in any way, right? So I think that a further wrinkle in this is not only that lives that there are different kinds of goods that are sort of not compatible within the same life, so that you've got to do the acting, you can't do the photography, you can't do both excellently. You have to settle for something less than excellence in at least one of those things. There are other kinds of good lives where, from a detached perspective, it looks like we might want to go with the pluralist and say, Arnoldian tradition, yeah, that's a good kind of life. Millian individuality, that's a good kind of life. But you can only adopt that view of those two lives from some third life. Right? To inhabit either of those two positions is to have a hostile relation towards the goods, the supposed goods on the other side. Right? So I think you're right, that there are all kinds of cases in which a kind of stick-to-itiveness, you're pursuing the thing that is not hopeless, that you're able to do while you're maintaining your love of something else. I think the pluralist, the monist, anybody can say, yeah, that's perfectly fine, and maybe that's a good thing, right? Maybe you shouldn't abandon in some wholesale way all of your aspirations, even if you can't pursue all of them all in a wholesale way. But I think the pluralist is also committed to this other kind of value conflict, where to accept one thing of value is to reject the idea that some other things are valuable at all. And that's a much more tricky sort of case, right? But thank you. Thank you.